There's a moment in the Imperium when a name stops being a name and becomes a sentence. It is not spoken to the condemned. It is entered into a data slate, sealed by sigil and authority, and transmitted outward through administrative channels that never question what they carry. Somewhere, a scribe stylus pauses for a fraction of a second as the words are inscribed. Excommunicate Traitoris. From that instant onward, the individual it refers to ceases to exist in any way that matters. Not because they are dead, but because the Imperium has decided they were never truly alive to begin with. Every oath they swore is void. Every battle they fought is erased. Every sacrifice they made is reclassified as contamination. What follows is not execution. It is something far more complete. A systematic unmaking that reaches backward into memory and forward into fate, until even survival itself becomes a form of heresy. If you're drawn to stories that explore the darkest machinery of the Imperium with lore-accurate detail and cinematic weight, consider supporting the channel by liking the video, sharing it with those who walk these shadows with you, and subscribing. In the Imperium, remembrance is power, and forgetting is a weapon. The words themselves are never shouted. They are not delivered at gunpoint or proclaimed from cathedral steps. They are entered quietly, with ritual precision, into systems so old that no single mind remembers their origin. Somewhere within the Administratum's endless vaults, a robed scribe receives an authorization cipher stamped with sigils that override hesitation. He does not know the full story. He is not permitted to. His duty is not judgment, but transmission. The data slate accepts the command, seals it behind layers of verification, and begins to replicate it outward, thread by thread, across the Imperium's bureaucratic nervous system. From that moment forward, the individual name within the order no longer exists in any way the Imperium recognizes. Excommunicate Traitoris is not an execution, because death would be too simple. Death ends responsibility. This sentence multiplies it. It reaches backward, invalidating oaths once sworn before banners and shrines. It reaches outward, contaminating associations, friendships, command structures. It reaches inward, redefining the condemned not as an enemy to be fought, but as a contradiction that must be corrected. The Imperium does not merely want them gone. It wants reality to behave as though they were always an error. The first effects are administrative, and that is what makes them so terrifying. Rank insignia become meaningless overnight. Access codes fail without explanation. Munitorum records quietly update, reclassifying years of service as clerical anomalies. In battle reports, the condemned's name is replaced with blank space, then removed entirely in subsequent revisions. To an outsider, it appears as routine correction. To those who know what they are seeing, it is the beginning of annihilation. No announcement is made to the subject themselves. The Imperium does not grant the dignity of awareness. One moment, orders are being issued and received as normal. The next, Vox grills return only static. Astropathic requests go unanswered. A supply convoy reroutes without explanation, leaving promised resources absent at the moment they are most needed. These are not coincidences. They are protocols activating in sequence, each designed to look like failure rather than intent. Panic reveals guilt. Confusion isolates. Silence finishes the work. Those who encounter condemned in this early phase often do not understand what has happened. A regimental officer hesitates, sensing something wrong, but lacking the authority to name it. A ship's captain refuses docking clearance, citing revised orders that arrived moments ago. A manufacturer overseer turns away, apologetic but firm, insisting the paperwork no longer supports cooperation. No one raises their voice. No one explains. Explanation is unnecessary when doctrine has already decided. The most insidious aspect of Excommunicate Traitoris is how it weaponizes loyalty. Former comrades are not ordered to hate. They are ordered to remember differently. Shared victories are reinterpreted as contamination. Past sacrifices become suspect. Even questioning the revision places one dangerously close to association. The Imperium does not need to threaten those around the condemned. It simply presents them with a choice between sanctioned reality and personal memory. Most choose survival. In the sealed records of the Inquisition, the sentence is described not as punishment, but as correction of narrative drift. There are truths the Imperium cannot allow to stabilize. Individuals who possess such truths cannot always be killed without consequence. Martyrdom inspires belief. Public execution invites scrutiny. But Erasure starves ideas quietly, forcing them to wither without witnesses. Excommunicate Traitoris is reserved for threats that persist beyond death. Threats whose very memory could undermine the Imperium's claimed inevitability. For the condemned, the realization arrives slowly, often too late. They notice patterns first. A delay here, a refusal there. Then the pattern sharpens into certainty. The Imperium has not turned against them in anger. It has turned away. They are no longer part of the system's calculations. They exist in the margins, unaccounted for, dangerous not because of what they might do, but because of what they represent. An exception. And exceptions are intolerable. The sentence does not require immediate pursuit. It does not demand execution squads or dramatic confrontation. It allows the galaxy itself to close around the target, tightening through law, faith, and silence. Every door that remains shut reinforces the verdict. Every unanswered call confirms it. The condemned may still breathe, still fight, still think, but each act occurs outside recognition. In the Imperium, that is the beginning of a deeper death. The realization, when it finally settles, does not arrive as terror. Terror requires clarity. This arrives as disorientation, the sense that gravity has shifted a fraction of a degree and the body is not yet adjusted. The condemned begins to understand that resistance is no longer being measured. Their actions are not being countered because they are no longer being tracked in any meaningful way. The Imperium has stopped reacting to them, and that absence of response is the most definitive verdict it can deliver. Attempts to reassert legitimacy only deepen the trap. A formal appeal routed through Administratum channels returns without acknowledgement, its data slate flagged as malformed. A request for clarification sent through an astropathic choir echoes back distorted, stripped of identifiers, as though the message itself were unsure who it belonged to. Even personal seals and genetic markers fail to authenticate. The systems are not malfunctioning. They are obeying a higher-order instruction that treats the condemned as a null value. This is where desperation begins to erode discipline. The condemned may try to lean on old alliances, believing loyalty will outweigh doctrine. It never does. An Astra Militarum regiment that once followed their orders now receives revised directives identifying the individual as a doctrinal hazard. The wording is precise, almost gentle. Engage only if containment is required. Avoid prolonged interaction. Do not record dialogue. Memory is to be minimized. The soldiers comply not because they hate, but because obedience has always been safer than thought. The most chilling encounters are with those who still recognize the condemned, who still remember their voice, their decisions, the weight of their command. These individuals do not argue. They avert their gaze. They speak and rehearse phrases that create distance without confrontation. I cannot assist. I am not authorized. You should not be here. Each sentence lands like a barrier, closing off paths that once felt permanent. Friendship does not end in betrayal. It ends in procedure. For those trained in imperial structures, the implications are unmistakable. To be Excommunicate Traitoris is to be cut off not only from support, but from context. The Imperium's greatest weapon has never been its armies. It has been its ability to define meaning. By stripping an individual classification, it renders their actions illegible. Victories achieved after the sentence are not recorded as victories. Losses inflicted by the condemned are attributed to environmental instability, enemy action, or clerical error. The target becomes a ghost whose impact cannot accumulate. Survival under these conditions requires adaptation that borders on self-betrayal. The condemned must learn to move without recognition, to operate in spaces where imperial oversight thins. Black markets, fringe void ports, half-abandoned stations become refuges not because they are safe, but because they are beneath notice. Even here, danger follows. Bounty hunters and zealots occasionally appear, not officially sanctioned, but eager to prove their loyalty by erasing a name they've been told should not exist. These encounters are chaotic, driven by rumor rather than order, and they carry a particular cruelty. The condemned is no longer an enemy of the Imperium. They are an opportunity for others to demonstrate obedience. Sleep becomes fractured, Dreams replay moments that have been officially nullified, victories that now belong to no one. Waking brings a constant effort of suppression, the need to avoid patterns of behavior that might draw attention. Even language changes. Titles are abandoned. Names are shortened, then discarded. Identity becomes a liability. The condemned learns to think of themselves as a function rather than a person, a series of actions disconnected from legacy or future. Yet something else begins to surface beneath the fear. Anger gives way to clarity. The realization that the Imperium's power depends not on omniscience, but on consensus. Excommunicate Traitoris works because everyone agrees to behave as if the sentence is final. It is a shared hallucination enforced by fear. The condemned exists outside that agreement now. And that position, however precarious, offers a dangerous kind of freedom. They are no longer bound by expectation. They have already lost everything the Imperium can take without killing them. This is the moment the sentence was designed to reach, where isolation becomes pressure and pressure becomes collapse, where the individual either destroys themselves, trying to reclaim a place that no longer exists, or hardens into something incompatible with imperial order. The Imperium does not care which outcome occurs. Both resolve the anomaly. As Chapter 1 draws towards close, the condemned stands at the edge of this transformation, no longer recognized, no longer supported, and no longer certain which parts of their former self can be carried forward. The sentence has not ended their story. It has stripped it of witnesses. And in a galaxy where belief shapes reality, that may be the most dangerous condition of all. The final stage of realization arrives not through loss, but through absence of consequence. The condemned test the edges of their erasure carefully at first, then with growing certainty. They interfere with a supply route, and no reprisal comes. They transmit a false signal through an unsecured Vox relay, and no correction follows. They kill a loyal Imperial officer in full view of witnesses, and the incident is logged as enemy action, the perpetrator unnamed, the cause unresolved. The Imperium does not respond because it cannot. Not without acknowledging a contradiction it has already decided does not exist. This is a paradox at the heart of Excommunicate Traitoris. The sentence is meant to suffocate. Instead, it creates a void. And voids in the galaxy of the 41st millennium do not remain empty for long. Without sanction, the condemned no longer feels a subtle psychic weight that presses on every Imperial citizen. The omnipresent sense of being watched, cataloged, measured by unseen authorities begins to fade. At first, this feels like relief. Then it becomes disquieting. The background pressure that once shaped thought and behavior is gone, leaving silence where guidance once existed. Some describe it as stepping outside a storm and realizing how loud the wind had been all along. Others feel exposed, as if a protective layer has been stripped away. This absence extends beyond bureaucracy. Faith falters in unfamiliar ways. Prayers once recited automatically now feel hollow, their cadence broken, their destination uncertain. The Emperor's presence, so constant within Imperial life that it becomes invisible, grows distant. Not hostile, not absent, simply no longer focused. The condemned does not feel rejected by the master of mankind. They feel unnoticed. In a universe where belief exerts pressure, that absence carries consequences no catechism prepares one to endure. It is here that the sentence's deeper danger emerges. Cut off from Imperial recognition, the condemned becomes unanchored in ways that doctrine does not account for. Identity in Imperium is reinforced by structure, rank, ritual, repetition. Remove those, and the self must be rebuilt from fragments. Some cling desperately to old habits, maintaining discipline without purpose, saluting empty corridors, issuing orders to no one. These individuals rarely last. They fracture under the strain of sustaining meaning alone. Others adapt. They begin to operate according to internal logic, rather than external sanction. Decisions are made based on survival, then necessity, then principle stripped of ideology. Morality simplifies. Acts are weighed by outcome rather than approval. This transformation is not heroic. It is efficient. And efficiency, divorced from oversight, is precisely what the Imperium fears. Rumors circulate in the shadows of void ports and fringe systems about figures who move between factions untouched, who speak Imperial High Gothic, without accent yet carry no record, no past that could be verified. These figures are never confirmed. They do not appear in reports. They exist only as cautionary tales traded quietly among those who know how erasure works. The Inquisition dismisses such stories publicly, while privately ensuring they remain stories rather than precedents. By the end of Chapter 1, the condemned has crossed an irreversible threshold. They are no longer merely hunted or hidden. They are something the Imperium cannot fully model, a human being operating outside the structures that define humanity within Imperial space. The sentence has achieved its purpose, but not its conclusion. The anomaly persists, and persistence, once acknowledged, demands response. The Imperium does not send a single force after those declared Excommunicate Traitoris. It sends everything, slowly, without ever appearing to do so. The hunt begins not with gunfire, but with alignment. Databases adjust. Threat parameters update. Doctrinal guidance shifts by fractions of a degree that only trained minds notice. Somewhere within the Lex Imperialis, a clause once dormant is activated, allowing enforcers to act without waiting for confirmation. Somewhere else, a priest receives a revised sermon emphasizing vigilance against contamination. No name is spoken. None is needed. The system knows what to do. For the condemned, pursuit does not feel like being chased. It feels like gravity increasing. Space narrows. Options collapse. A void port that once welcomed trade now insists on redundant inspections. A charted warp route becomes unavailable without explanation. A rogue trader who might once have bargained now refuses even to meet. Their smiles tight with the knowledge that association alone could invite scrutiny. Every refusal is polite. Every barrier is procedural. Violence, when it comes, arrives as an afterthought. The Astra Militarum responds first, not as executioners, but as instruments of denial. Patrols adjust routes to intersect potential movement corridors. Garrisons receive updated threat silhouettes stripped of identity markers. The condemned is no longer a person to be arrested or questioned. They are conditioned to be corrected. Soldiers are instructed not to speak names, not to engage in dialogue longer than necessary, not to preserve artifacts. These orders are obeyed because they are familiar. The Militarum has always been taught that hesitation kills. Encounters with former comrades are the most destabilizing. A squad that once trusted the condemned with their lives now reacts with disciplined distance, weapons raised without anger. There is no accusation, no shouted condemnation, only the cold efficiency of drill response. The condemned recognizes the posture immediately. This is not fear. It is training overriding memory. The realization cuts deeper than betrayal ever could. The Imperium has succeeded in turning shared history into a liability. Faith follows close behind. The ecclesiarchy does not issue a proclamation naming the condemned a heretic. It does something more effective. It alters emphasis. Sermons linger longer on the dangers of deviation. Shrines are rededicated with prayers for purity of thought. Confessors begin asking questions that frame doubt itself as proximity to sin. The faithful respond instinctively, avoiding those whose presence feels doctrinally uncertain. In this way, the condemned becomes isolated even in crowds, surrounded by people who sense wrongness without understanding why. The Adeptus Arbites operate with surgical restraint. Warrants appear that do not list crimes, only conditions. Areas are sealed temporarily, then reopened after inspections that find nothing, because nothing is meant to be found. Witnesses are questioned, not about what they saw, but about what they remember. Memory becomes evidence. Inconsistencies are corrected through re-education, fines, or disappearance. The condemned learns quickly that every interaction leaves a residue that others must later scrub away. To exist is to endanger. This is the true weight of the sentence. The Imperium does not simply hunt the condemned. It hunts the impact they leave behind. Every footstep, every word spoken, every decision made creates ripples that must be flattened. Over time, the effort required to maintain that flattening increases. The galaxy itself begins to resist being smoothed so thoroughly. Minor errors accumulate. Rumors persist. Patterns emerge where none should. As Chapter 2 opens fully, the condemned is no longer merely surviving. They are moving through a lattice of pursuit that adapts with unsettling intelligence. Law, faith, and memory converge not to destroy them outright, but to ensure they never become stable again. The Imperium does not need them dead. It needs them unresolved. The condemned learns that there are no neutral spaces in Imperium, only gradients of attention. Some places are watched by auspex arrays and administratum audits. Others are watched by priests. Others by hunger, gang rule, or the quiet predation of desperation. Even the most forgotten half-block has a rhythm of reporting, a chain of minor authorities who survive by proving they still matter. To slip through this lattice, the condemned must become fluent in the Imperium's smallest motions. Who speaks to who pays whom, which doors open only when no one is looking. At first, they try to move quickly. Speed feels like safety. But speed draws patterns, and patterns invite scrutiny. The condemned learns to move like decay instead, slow and spreading, leaving nothing that can be clearly traced. A stolen uniform here, a falsified transit token there, a name borrowed from a corpse on a battlefield no one will ever revisit. Survival becomes a craft built from imperfections, because perfection is always suspicious in a galaxy of rusted systems. The most dangerous moments are those when the hunt becomes personal. Official pursuit is efficient, but it remains procedural. The true predators are the zealots who consider the sentence a blessing. They prowl in the gaps between sanctioned authority, hoping to be the one who ends a threat the Imperium has declared unworthy of a clean death. These hunters are not always skilled. They are always persistent. They interpret coincidence as omen, rumor as proof, and every shadow as confirmation. They do not need accuracy. They only need an excuse to act. When violence comes, it comes without ceremony. A blade in a crowd, a shot fired from behind a shrine, a stun net thrown by Arbite's auxiliaries, who do not even bother to shout a warning. The condemned survives by anticipating the Imperium's habits. The preference for containment over spectacle, the instinct to minimize witnesses, the tendency to seal corridors rather than pursue into uncertainty. Each escape leaves behind bodies and questions that must be flattened, and flattening breeds resentment among those tasked with maintaining the lie. The hunt becomes heavier, not because the condemned is more dangerous, but because their continued existence is increasing the cost of erasure. Food becomes scarce. Water becomes negotiated. Ammunition is never purchased openly. Even the simplest acts carry risk because every transaction creates documentation, and documentation is the Imperium's true language. The condemned begins to rely on barter, on favors owed by people who operate outside official oversight. Smugglers, scrap priests, voidsmen with no loyalty beyond their crew. These allies do not ask whether the condemned is guilty. They ask only whether association will kill them. Trust becomes temporary by necessity. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow. The mind rehearses exits instinctively. The body flinches at sudden sounds. The condemned starts to measure time not by days, but by windows of safety. How long before a rumor reaches an Arbite's precinct? How long before a missing shipment triggers an audit? How long before a priest recognizes a wrongness in a face that should not exist? There is a particular horror in being pursued not by hatred, but by inevitability. The Imperium does not tire. It does not forget. It adjusts. And yet, the condemned discovers something that feels almost impossible at first. The Imperium's attention is vast, but it is not infinite. In regions where war has hollowed out infrastructure, where orc raids have shattered logistics and Necron awakenings have turned whole sectors into zones of terror, the bureaucratic net tiers. In those places, survival becomes possible because everyone is already drowning. The condemned moves through battlefields and broken manufactoria because Imperium has too many crises to focus on a ghost. This does not bring peace. It brings a different kind of threat. In those torn places, the warp presses closer. Fear thickens the air. Dreams become sharper, stranger. The condemned hears prayers spoken in languages they do not know, not address them. Not necessarily, but drifting through the same psychic currents that carry all human desperation. Cut off from the Emperor's constant presence, the condemned feels the Immaterium's texture more directly. Not demons leaping from shadows, but the sense of being near an ocean without a shore. This is where memory itself becomes a weapon. The Imperium's greatest pursuit is not of bodies, but of narratives. It does not only hunt the condemned, it hunts the story that could form around them. In any place where the condemned stays too long, people begin to talk, not always with clarity, not always with truth, but enough to form a shape. A rumor, repeated, becomes a thread. Threads become patterns. Patterns become something the Imperium can grasp. So the condemned leaves. Again, always before their shadow solidifies into legend. By the end of this part, Chapter 2, the condemned understands that they are not merely fleeing execution. They are fleeing definition. The Imperium cannot fully destroy what it cannot name, but it can prevent it from becoming stable. It can keep it moving until exhaustion does what bullets cannot. And exhaustion, in the end, is the Imperium's most reliable executioner. The longer the hunt persists, the more it changes shape. What begins as pursuit becomes pressure, and pressure becomes environment. The condemned stops thinking in terms of enemies and starts thinking in terms of weather. A sector becomes unsafe not because Arbite's patrols are visible, but because trade patterns tighten. A city becomes hostile not because of open hostility, but because people stop asking questions they used to ask. The Imperium announces itself most clearly through what it removes. In rare moments, the condemned crosses paths with others like themselves. Not formally, not openly. There is no organization to be erased. There cannot be. Any structure stable enough to endure will be detected, dissected, and destroyed. Instead, there are glances held a second too long, phrases spoken with deliberate ambiguity, the exchange of information that sounds meaningless unless you already know what it means, routes through void space that do not appear on charts, shrines that are avoided not out of piety, but out of pattern recognition, survival knowledge passed without attribution, because attribution is dangerous. These encounters are brief, tense, and never sentimental. Shared status does not guarantee trust. Everyone here understands how easily desperation becomes leverage. Still, their existence proves something important. Excommunicate Traitoris does not always end in quiet death. It produces a population the Imperium insists does not exist, operating beneath its notice, shaped by its pressure but no longer governed by its permission. This realization is not empowering. It is destabilizing. The condemned begins to see the Imperium not as an omnipotent entity, but as a system sustained by compliance and fear. Vast, yes. Ruthless, certainly. But dependent. Every patrol requires fuel. Every audit requires scribes. Every act of erasure requires thousands of people choosing not to ask why. The sentence works because it is believed in absolutely. It fails where belief ends. That knowledge is dangerous. It does not inspire rebellion. It inspires adaptation. The condemned learns to exploit inefficiencies, to move where the Imperium's attention is already saturated. War zones, Xenos-infested regions, places where the Astra Militarum is losing faster than reports can be written. In these spaces, the Imperium's grip loosens not out of mercy, but out of necessity. There are only so many resources to allocate, only so many crises that can be flattened at once. But this freedom has a cost. Prolonged exposure to these margins changes people. The condemned notices in themselves first as impatience, then as recalibration. Decisions that once required deliberation are made instantly. Lives are weighed without ceremony. Collateral damage becomes data rather than tragedy. This is not corruption in the way the Imperium defines it. It is efficiency stripped of doctrine, and efficiency without doctrine is indistinguishable from threat. By the time Chapter 2 draws towards close, the Hun has accomplished its true purpose. The condemned is no longer a loyal subject wronged by authority. They are no longer even a fugitive seeking restoration. They are something shaped by sustained pressure, adapted to survive without sanction, capable of operating where imperial structures fail. The Imperium has not erased them. It has forged them, and forged tools, once made, rarely remain unused. The Inquisition does not announce itself when it enters a problem. It arrives already inside the margins, already embedded in the assumptions everyone else takes for granted. By the time an Inquisitor acknowledges the existence of an anomaly, that anomaly has usually been under observation for years, framed by hypotheses that will never appear in open record. Excommunicate Traitoris is one of those hypotheses made actionable. It is not a verdict reached at the end of investigation. It is a method of investigation, deployed when truth itself is judged too volatile to be handled directly. Those who believe the sentence is reserved for traitors misunderstand its purpose. Treason can be punished with execution, public denunciation, or exemplary war. Excommunicate Traitoris is invoked when punishment would clarify the threat rather than dissolve it. When killing someone risks validating their claims, galvanizing dissent, or anchoring a narrative the Imperium cannot later unwind. In such cases, death is not erasure. It is punctuation, and punctuation invites reading. The Inquisition learned this lesson early. There are precedents sealed beneath sigils so old their meanings are inferred rather than known. Cases where execution transformed isolated deviations into enduring myths. Martyrs are efficient vectors. They require no logistics once created. The Imperium does not fear martyrs because they are brave. It fears them because they simplify. They give shape to doubt. Excommunicate Traitoris denies that shape by denying sequence. It removes the beginning, the middle, and the end at once. Within inquisitorial doctrine, the sentence is described as containment through negation. The subject is not to be interrogated, because interrogation implies value. They are not to be debated, because debate implies symmetry. They are to be treated as a systemic fault, isolated until it collapses under its own instability. Every interaction with the condemned is designed to shorten their half-life, not by violence alone, but by accelerating entropy around them. This is why the sentence is paired with silence protocols that extend far beyond the target. Witnesses are monitored not for loyalty, but for curiosity. Archives are scrubbed not of conclusions, but of context. Data slate fragments that could allow reconstruction are separated and reclassified under unrelated indices. Even the Inquisition does not keep a single, complete record. Centralization is vulnerability. Truth survives by scattering, and so the Imperium scatters it first. From the condemned's perspective, this manifests as a tightening fog. Encounters that once felt random acquire coherence that is impossible to confirm. An Arbite's checkpoint appears 1 hour earlier than expected. A void ship captain receives a warning that feels too specific to be coincidence. A bounty hunter arrives with information that could only have come from sealed sources. The Inquisition is not hunting openly. It is adjusting probabilities, nudging outcomes until survival becomes statistically unlikely without ever becoming narratively meaningful. Inquisitors themselves rarely approach the condemned directly. Direct contact risks recognition, and recognition risks legitimization. When they do intervene, it is through intermediaries, confessor agents, informant networks, deniable kill teams whose orders are framed as preventative hygiene. Even these assets are kept deliberately ignorant. They are told enough to act, never enough to understand. Understanding is where sympathy begins. The most unsettling realization is that the Inquisition is not attempting to end condemned quickly. It is measuring them. Each escape, each adaptation, each moral compromise is data. The question is not whether the individual will survive, but what they become under sustained erasure. If they break, the anomaly resolves itself. If they persist, the Imperium learns something useful about the limits of its own authority. There are cases, unconfirmed, denied, but persistent, where this process is allowed to continue far longer than doctrine would suggest. In these cases, the condemned becomes a mobile stress test, revealing fault lines in Imperial control. Where do records fail first? Which institutions hesitate? How belief bends when procedure no longer aligns with lived experience? The Inquisition does not celebrate these outcomes. It catalogs them. Survival under Excommunicate Traitoris is not a victory. It is a report. This reframes the hunt entirely. The condemned is no longer merely being pursued by law, faith, and memory. They are being studied by an institution that considers entire sectors acceptable losses if the insight gained prevents a greater destabilization later. The Imperium's cruelty is not accidental. It is methodological. As this chapter's first movement draws to a close, the condemned begins to sense the difference between random pursuit and deliberate calibration. Traps feel less frantic. Responses feel delayed by design. The pressure is no longer trying to crush them outright. It is testing their shape. And the most dangerous test of all is this: whether something can exist long enough outside imperial recognition to stop needing it. The realization that they are being measured arrives without drama. There is no intercepted transmission spelling it out, no captured agent offering confession. It comes through rhythm. The condemned notices that the Imperium's responses no longer seek to corner them at moments of weakness. Instead, pressure is applied when survival seems almost assured. A route remains open just long enough to invite use, then closes behind them with surgical precision. A contact is allowed to speak, to offer assistance, to build a fragile bridge of trust, and only then is that contact removed, not publicly, not violently, but cleanly, as if they had simply never existed. These are not mistakes. They are experiments. The Inquisition's hand is subtle because subtlety preserves data. Sudden annihilation teaches nothing. Sustained stress reveals everything. How far will the condemned go when resources thin further? Which lines will they refuse to cross, even when refusal costs lives? At what point does survival override doctrine so completely that the individual becomes indistinguishable from the threats the Imperium claims to oppose? These questions are not philosophical. They are operational. The answers inform future policy, future sentences, future erasures. This is why the condemned is sometimes allowed to win. A small victory here, an escape there, not enough to build momentum, but enough to prevent collapse. The Inquisition understands morale as well as any Lord General. A cornered animal dies quickly. A creature that believes it can endure will continue long enough to be understood. Hope, carefully rationed, becomes another instrument of control. The condemned begins to recognize the signs of this rationing. They sense when an Arbite's patrol arrives too late, when a bounty hunter's shot goes wide at a moment that should have been fatal. These reprieves feel unnatural, not because they are merciful, but because they are precise. The Imperium is not failing to kill them. It is choosing not to, yet that knowledge corrodes resolve more effectively than fear ever could. Survival no longer feels earned. It feels permitted. Isolation deepens in response. Trust becomes not merely risky, but irrelevant. If every ally might be an allowed variable, every refuge a calibrated space, then the only remaining certainty is internal. The condemned withdraws further into themselves, stripping decisions down to intent and outcome. Loyalty is replaced by alignment of necessity. Mercy becomes conditional. Violence becomes procedural. These shifts are not sudden. They are incremental, each one justified by context, each one recorded somewhere by unseen observers. The Inquisition does not need to provoke corruption. It allows adaptation to do the work. A human forced to live without recognition, without future, without absolution, will eventually redefine themselves around endurance alone. That redefinition is a true subject of study. The Imperium wants to know what emerges when its ultimate negation does not succeed immediately, whether the result is a broken fugitive, a hardened survivor, or something that no longer fits any sanctioned category. There are moments when the condemned consider surrender, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. The thought is always the same. If the Imperium is already writing the story, perhaps choosing the ending is the last remaining agency. But surrender requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is precisely what Excommunicate Traitoris denies. There is no guarantee of interrogation, no certainty of death, no promise of closure. Only the likelihood that surrender itself will be erased, converted into another unresolved entry that feeds the same machinery. Even despair finds no purchase here. As this part chapter 3 draws toward its end, the condemned understands the most unsettling truth yet. The Inquisition is not asking whether they are guilty or innocent, loyal or corrupt. Those categories no longer apply. It is asking whether the Imperium's ultimate sentence actually works in all cases, whether Erasure can truly unmake a human being, or whether, under sufficient pressure, it creates something that survives precisely because it has been denied every sanctioned way to exist. The hunt continues, but its purpose has shifted. The condemned is no longer just a target. They are a test case. The test does not end when limits are reached. It ends when something changes. For a long time, the condemned believes that change will come as collapse, a final breaking point where fear or exhaustion erases what remains of their former self. Instead, it arrives as distance, a subtle but unmistakable separation from the emotional weight that once defined each decision. The Imperium's judgments, its rituals of loyalty and betrayal, begin to feel less personal, less absolute. Not false, but provincial. Rules designed for those who still exist within the system lose relevance to someone who has already been written out of it. This shift does not make the condemned fearless. It makes them precise. Risk is no longer avoided instinctively. It is evaluated. Pain is no longer a warning. It is information. Even guilt becomes negotiable, weighed against outcome rather than doctrine. From the Inquisition's perspective, this is the most dangerous phase. A fugitive driven by desperation is predictable. One driven by clarity is not. The pressure applied now becomes more refined. Instead of tightening nets, the Imperium introduces dilemmas. The condemned is given opportunities to act in ways that will leave visible scars. A convoy they could destroy, knowing the resulting shortage will starve a hive's lower levels. A data vault they could expose, knowing the truth inside will destabilize a loyal world. Each option is survivable. Each option is consequential. Refusal preserves moral integrity but costs strategic advantage. Action secures resources or leverage but deepens a condemned separation from the Imperium they once served. These are not traps meant to kill. They are mirrors. When the condemned chooses, the choice is recorded, not in a single file, but across distributed observations. How quickly was a decision made? How many alternatives were considered? Whether regret followed? The Inquisition does not judge the choice itself. It measures what kind of act the condemned is becoming, whether they still frame their actions in imperial terms, or whether those terms have finally lost meaning. The most telling moments occur when the condemned encounters suffering they did not cause. Refugees fleeing a conflict sparked by unrelated imperial action. Civilians crushed by a war the condemned merely passed through. In these moments, there is no immediate benefit to intervention. Helping risks exposure. Ignoring preserves safety. The decision reveals whether empathy still competes with endurance, whether the condemned is becoming a survivor or something colder. By now, the condemned understands that the Imperium will never formally acknowledge this process. There will be no declaration that the test is complete, no verdict rendered. Completion will be inferred when the pattern stabilizes, when the condemned's behavior becomes predictable again, either through self-destruction, capture, or transformation into a threat that can be justified openly. Excommunicate Traitoris ends only when ambiguity does. As this phase of the hunt stretches on, the condemned senses that the pressure is no longer increasing. It has plateaued. The Imperium is waiting, watching to see whether the anomaly resolves itself or evolves beyond containment. The silence that follows is heavier than pursuit ever was, because it places a burden of motion entirely on the condemned. For the first time since the sentence was passed, there's a choice that feels real: to continue running indefinitely until exhaustion ends the experiment, or to act decisively enough that the Imperium is forced to remember a name it has already erased. And that decision, once made, will determine whether Excommunicate Traitoris remains the Imperium's final tool or becomes its most dangerous failure. The decisive act does not come with certainty. It never does. It arrives wrapped in necessity, disguised as a problem that must be solved rather than a statement that must be made. The condemned does not wake one day resolved to force the Imperium's hand. They are pushed there by accumulation. Too many calculated pressures, too many engineered dilemmas, too many moments where strain has preserved nothing but delay. The realization settles quietly that continued motion without impact serves the Inquisition's purpose better than their own survival ever could. What changes is not intent, but scale. The condemned chooses an action that cannot be flattened easily. Not a massacre, not a spectacle rage, but an interference that strikes at structure rather than symbol. A data vault whose content are not heretical, but inconvenient. A logistics junction whose disruption does not kill immediately, but exposes how fragile an entire campaign truly is. The choice is precise, informed by months of observation, designed to propagate consequences faster than sensors can erase context. It is not rebellion. It is leverage. The Imperium responds differently this time. There is hesitation, not at the level of the Astra Militarum or the Adeptus Arbites, who continue to act according to procedure, but deeper, where response trees branch into options that have not been exercised in centuries. The Inquisition recognizes a shift immediately. This is no longer a fugitive behaving under pressure. This is an actor imposing pressure their own. The anomaly is no longer passive. It is interacting with the system in ways that threaten to produce narrative before it can be dismantled. Containment escalates, but with caution. Kill teams are dispatched, then redirected. Orders are issued, then revised. The Imperium does not panic, but it recalculates. Erasure is still the preferred solution, but erasure now risks leaving an outline too visible to ignore. The condemned has crossed the threshold the sentence was designed to prevent. They have acted in a way that demands explanation. For the first time since the declaration of Excommunicate Traitoris, the possibility of acknowledgement surfaces. Not public acknowledgement, never that, but internal recognition. A name is spoken in a sealed chamber, not as identity, but as reference. A pattern is labeled. A probability curve is updated. The Inquisition does not admit failure, but it does record deviation. The test has yielded results. From a condemned's perspective, the response feels different immediately. Pressure sharpens rather than spreads. The environment no longer closes gradually. It tightens decisively. Routes vanish entirely. Contacts disappear without the pretense of accident. The calibration phase is over. Observation has given way to resolution. Whatever the Imperium decides to do next, it will do cleanly. And yet, there is something else now, something that was not present before. Recognition leaves residue. Even denied, even suppressed, it changes the texture of pursuit. The condemned senses in the way traps are set with less patience, in the way response time shorten. The Imperium remembers just enough to act decisively, and remembering, even briefly, undermines the absolute negation Excommunicate Traitoris relies upon. This is the irony the sentence cannot escape. To erase completely, the Imperium must never engage. To resolve completely, it must. The moment engagement becomes necessary, erasure begins to fail. As Chapter 3 closes, the condemned stands no longer as a test subject, but as a problem that has exceeded its intended parameters. The Inquisition will still win. It almost always does. But the outcome will no longer be clean. Something has been learned. Something has been exposed. And somewhere within the Imperium sealed archives, a file will exist that should not, referencing an individual who officially never was. That file will never be opened again, but it will not be destroyed either. The Imperium insists that identity is granted from above. Name, rank, purpose, absolution, all bestowed, all revocable. Yet, once Excommunicate Traitoris has been invoked and Erasure has failed to conclude cleanly, an uncomfortable truth begins to surface in the margins of sealed doctrine. There are souls the Imperium cannot kill, not because they are immortal, but because they no longer occupy the structures death is meant to resolve. They exist outside the equations that define loyalty and treason, faith and heresy, service and defiance. Rumors of such individuals circulate only where authority thins. In void stations abandoned by Administratum oversight, in shrine world underlevels where the Emperor's name is whispered more from habit than belief, in war zones where survival has replaced ideology. These accounts are inconsistent, fragmented, and aggressively denied, yet they share a disturbing coherence. They speak of figures who move through Imperial space without attracting the warp's usual predation, whose presence dampens rather than excites psychic turbulence. Not saints, not demons. Something quieter, something unresolved. The ecclesiarchy dismisses these stories as apostate folklore. The Inquisition classifies them as contamination narratives, self-correcting through disbelief. And yet, certain Ordo Malleus case files note anomalies that do not align with either chaos incursion or sanctioned miracle. Psychers report areas of reduced psychic resonance following the passage of unnamed individuals. Astropaths describe messages that momentarily lose emotional charge when routed near certain locations, as if belief itself thins in their wake. These observations are never connected publicly. Privately, they are quarantined. The condemned, moving through these spaces, begins to feel the change internally before any external confirmation appears. Cut off from imperial recognition, faith no longer presses inward as constant reinforcement, nor does the warp respond with immediate hunger. Instead, there's neutrality, a strange absence of pull. The Imperium does not claw at them the way it does the faithful or the damned. It watches. That watching is not benevolent, but it is not hostile either. It is evaluative. In sanctioned imperial doctrine, this state should not exist. A soul without anchor should be vulnerable. A human stripped of faith and structure should attract predation. Yet these individuals persist, not untouched, but altered. Their dreams grow quieter, not peaceful, but less crowded. The Emperor's presence, once a background constant, fades into something distant and observational. This is not abandonment. It is disengagement. The condemned is no longer part of the exchange belief sustains. Here, the metaphysical implications grow dangerous and must remain framed as rumor rather than truth. Some forbidden texts suggest that the warp responds most violently to intensity, of devotion, of hatred, of desperation. Remove those extremes and the sea grows calmer, not because it is tamed, but because there is less for it to seize. In this interpretation, Excommunicate Traitoris does not merely erase social identity. It strips psychic signature, thinning the soul's imprint until it becomes harder to grasp. If true, this would mean the Imperium's ultimate punishment creates a category of human existence it cannot easily control or destroy. Not rebels fueled by ideology, not heretics burning with faith, but survivors operating in a muted register, less visible to both authority and the warp. This possibility terrifies the Inquisition far more than open rebellion ever could. You cannot crusade against what does not proclaim itself. Accounts of such figures always end the same way. They never remain visible for long. Either they disappear into the void entirely, their fate unrecorded, or they are eventually forced into action that reintroduces intensity, belief, or consequence, at which point the warp's attention returns, and the Imperium's instruments regain traction. Neutrality cannot be sustained indefinitely in a galaxy structured around extremes. The condemned senses this truth intuitively. They understand that their current state is temporary, a narrow passage between annihilation and transformation. To remain unseen, they must remain unimportant. To matter again is to invite definition, and definition in the Imperium is always followed by judgment. The question shifts from survival to choice, whether it persists as an unresolved anomaly, slowly eroding under the weight of invisibility, or to step back into consequence, knowing exactly what will follow. The Imperium cannot kill what it cannot fully perceive, but it can wait. And waiting for an empire built on eternity is not a weakness. Yes, the danger of invisibility is not that it erases you, it is that it hollows you out. For a time, the condemned believes they have found a stable equilibrium. Imperial sensors pass over them without locking. Psychic turbulence slips around their presence instead of spiking. They move through hive underlevels and fringe void stations with a strange ease, noticed only as another exhausted body among millions. No prayers cling to them. No curses follow. Even fear seems muted, as if the galaxy itself has agreed not to look too closely. But neutrality is not freedom. It is attrition without violence, without opposition, without recognition, without consequence. Purpose begins to thin. Actions lose narrative weight. Victories feel indistinct from survival. Losses feel abstract. The condemned starts to understand why the Imperium relies so heavily on identity and ritual, meaning one stripped of external reinforcement must be generated internally, and that requires a strength few possess indefinitely. Isolation becomes existential rather than physical. There are days when the condemned speaks, aloud simply confirm their voice still exists. This is when memory becomes the most dangerous enemy of all. Not imperial memory, which has already been severed, but personal memory. Faces once trusted, orders once given, battles once fought under banners that no longer acknowledge their existence. These memories no longer anchor identity. They destabilize it. The condemned realizes that continuing to remember themselves as they were is a form of slow self-destruction. That version of the self depends on recognition that will never return. Some choose erasure their own making. They abandon names completely. They stop recounting their past even internally. They let habits dissolve. These individuals fade fastest, becoming functionally invisible to everything, including themselves. Whether they die, vanish into the warp's quieter eddies, or persist as empty motion is never recorded. From the Imperium's perspective, these cases resolve cleanly. Others resist that dissolution. They hold on to memory not as nostalgia, but as defiance. They remember not to reclaim legitimacy, but to maintain continuity of self. This choice is heavier. Memory sharpens emotion. Emotion sharpens psychic presence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warp begins to notice again. Dreams regain texture. Fear returns with edges. The condemned feels watched once more, not by demons or gods, but by possibility. This is a line the Inquisition has always waited for them to cross. The Imperium understands something fundamental about the Immaterium that few admit openly. Total negation and total intensity are both unstable states. What persists is oscillation. Pressure applied, pressure released. Identity stripped, identity reasserted. The condemned, by choosing to remain a person rather than a shadow, begins to generate signal again, and signal, however faint, can be tracked. The Inquisition does not intervene immediately. It allows the signal to strengthen, to clarify. It wants certainty. Once the condemned becomes something definable again, a protector of refugees, a saboteur of imperial logistics, a figure whispered about with consistency, the machinery of erasure can be replaced with the machinery of elimination. Neutrality collapses into narrative, and narrative can be killed. The condemned feels this shift before they can articulate it. Encounters become sharper. Coincidences tighten. A bounty hunter arrives with information that should not exist. A warp jump grows turbulent where it had been smooth for months. The quiet buffer that once insulated them begins to fail. Not suddenly. Predictably. This is the Imperium's final lesson, delivered without words. You may exist unseen for a time. You may even persist. But to matter is to be claimed by forces that demand definition. The galaxy does not tolerate the unresolved indefinitely. As Chapter 4 approaches its end, the condemned stands at the edge of that realization. To remain invisible is to fade into something less than human. To act with meaning is to invite annihilation. The Imperium cannot kill a soul it cannot perceive. But the moment that soul insists on being itself again, perception returns. The act that restores their humanity is not grand. It is small, and that is why it is irreversible. A child in a hive under level, coughing promethium soot and blood into a rag already too dark to show stains. A family cornered by Arbite's auxiliaries who are less concerned with justice than with quotas. A void's man beaten for asking for water from a cistern controlled by gang priests who sell cleanliness as indulgence. The condemned could walk away. They have walked away from worse. They have learned, painfully, that intervention creates ripples and ripples become threads. This time, they do not leave. They intervene with the same efficiency that once served imperial campaigns, but without the veneer of sanctioned righteousness. A weapon is raised. A thread is removed. A door is forced open. A route is cleared. The action takes seconds. The consequence begins immediately, not in the physical sense, not yet, but in texture. The air feels different afterward. The quiet neutrality that clung to them for months peels away, like a thin layer of dust disturbed. They feel their own presence again, sharper in the Immaterium, like a candle that has been shielded and is now exposed to wind. The people they help do not know who they are. They do not need to. Gratitude in the Imperium is dangerous. It forms bonds. Bonds create memory. Memory attracts attention. Still, the condemned sees in their eyes that instinctive attempt to categorize. Savior, criminal, saint, any label would be an anchor. The condemned leaves before one can settle. But something has already settled inside them. The choice was not tactical. It was moral. It was made in the language of being a person rather than a variable. That language carries weight. It produces a kind of psychic resonance the Imperium sentence had stripped away. And resonance is what the warp understands most intimately. Not truth, not law, emotion. That night, Sleep comes reluctantly, and when it comes it brings dreams with edges, not demonic visions, not the grotesque theatrics of corruption, but something more unsettling, clarity. The condemned dreams a hall of records, not within the Administratum, but within their own mind, shelves lined with names that have been cut out of reality. They wake with their heart racing, not from fear, but from the sensation of being observed by something that does not hate them and does not care whether they live. The Imperium's response begins with the smallest shifts. A checkpoint appears in a corridor that has never been watched. A voxcaster crackles with a warning that uses phrasing too precise to be coincidence. A contact who has survived 3 months of careful caution is found dead, not publicly executed, but removed. There is no message left behind. None is needed. The condemned understands. Their presence has become measurable again. This is not the full hunt returning. Not yet. It is the Inquisition confirming that the signal has strengthened, that the anomaly is reasserting identity. The test is nearing its conclusion. The condemned attempts to retreat into neutrality, to undo the resonance, to become a shadow again. It is harder now. Once a flame has been seen, shielding it does not erase the memory of his light. The condemned's actions begin to feel heavier. Each decision seems to echo longer. The warp, too, behaves differently. Jumps that once carried them cleanly now threaten turbulence. Dreams are more frequent, more coherent, as if the Immaterium is using them as an interface. This is where the rumor tier metaphysics becomes most dangerous, and must be treated as unreliable perception. Some would say that the condemned severance from imperial structure makes them less appetizing to predatory warp entities, but more interesting to other forces that do not feed on devotion or rage. Forces that respond to absence the way predators respond to silence. Whether such forces exist is not knowable. What is knowable is the condemned's experience. The feeling that by stepping back into meaning, they have re-entered a larger attention they cannot control. By the end of Chapter 4, the condemned is no longer balanced between invisibility and annihilation. They have tipped. They have chosen to be a person again, even briefly, even anonymously. That choice has restored everything the Imperium needs to destroy them. And yet it has also restored something else. The possibility that their existence could matter beyond survival. The Inquisition will not allow that possibility to become stable. It will move now with decisive intent. The question is whether the condemned can move first. The Imperium does not correct failure with apology. It corrects it with escalation until the narrative holds. When Excommunicate Traitoris fails to conclude cleanly, the system does not abandon the sentence. It refines it. The language in sealed orders changes first, becoming less procedural and more absolute. Containment becomes priority over discretion. Witness minimization becomes witness elimination. The hunt shifts from flattening ripples to preventing them from forming at all. The condemned is no longer merely an error in the record. They are a risk to the Imperium's ability to define reality. The Inquisition moves now not as an unseen hand, but as architecture. Entire routes are sealed. Void traffic is redirected. A planetary governor receives a directive that overrides local law and is not questioned because it is framed as spiritual hygiene. The Adeptus Arbites begin arrests not of suspects, but of those who might become witnesses. People vanish for asking the wrong question at the wrong time, not because they know anything, but because knowledge is less dangerous than curiosity. For the condemned, it feels like the galaxy has remembered them all at once. The quiet spaces that once offered refuge become loud with attention. Informant networks bloom overnight, fed by fear and rewarded by indulgence. Bounty hunters sharpen into coordinated packs, no longer chasing rumor, but following guidance they do not understand. Even ecclesiarchy's sermons become more pointed, not naming condemned, but emphasizing the danger of those who walk without blessing, those who live outside the Emperor's sight. The faithful begin to look at strangers differently, suspicion rising like incense. This is what the Imperium does best. It turns metaphysics into policy. It turns fear into consensus. The condemned knows that continued flight will end the same way it always has. Exhaustion, collapse, disappearance. Escalation has removed the possibility of invisibility. The only remaining choice is whether their end will be flattened into silence or sharpened into consequence. They do not imagine victory. Victory in the Imperium is often indistinguishable from becoming another weapon. What they imagine is impact. They choose to force the Imperium into a dilemma it cannot easily solve. Not by proclaiming innocence, because innocence is irrelevant under this sentence. Not by gathering followers, because followers are targets. But by placing information where it cannot be erased without revealing the act of erasure itself. A data slate fragment seeded into multiple manufacturing networks. A confession encoded into astropathic routing pulses timed to mimic legitimate traffic. A record of the sentence being applied, not as doctrine, but as method. Not enough to topple the Imperium. Enough to create an artifact. The Inquisition responds with fury disguised as calm. It scrubs networks, burns out relay stations, purges entire hab levels to remove the spread of a thing most will never understand. In doing so, it creates the very scars it hoped to avoid. The condemned has not been remembered as a person, but they have become a shape in Imperium's behavior. A pattern others might notice if they look closely enough. This is the last consequence of Excommunicate Traitoris. Even when it succeeds, it teaches the Imperium to destroy context as well as targets. It makes everyone poorer in truth, less stable in meaning. It keeps the system intact by hollowing it. In the final movement of the chapter, the condemned does not escape. Escape is no longer possible. They are cornered not by a single force, but by convergence. Kill teams close in with surgical intent. Arbite's cordons lock down streets. A preacher's voice rises in the distance, shaping the crowd into a weapon. The condemned stands in a narrow corridor of smoke and rust and realizes that the Imperium has finally achieved what the sentence was always meant to do. It has made their existence too costly to tolerate. And yet, in that final moment, the condemned understand the quiet failure embedded in the Imperium's victory. Erasure is not nothingness. It is work. It requires constant reinforcement, constant correction. It is a lie the Imperium must keep telling forever. And every lie that must be told forever becomes a weakness, because it depends on everyone agreeing to carry it. The condemned dies or disappears, whereas unmade in ways no record will preserve. The outcome is flattened. The story is severed. The Imperium continues. But somewhere, in a damaged data slate fragment or a half-remembered rumor whispered in a void port's shadow, the shape remains. Not a hero, not a martyr. A question. If the Imperium's final sentence can fail even once, then what else is it pretending is absolute? And what happens when enough people remember the lie at the same time?